Hello and welcome to Recalibrating with me, Sharee Johnson, where you'll hear healthcare professionals and others sharing their stories of recalibrating life when the unexpected happened. As a psychologist and a coach, I've been listening deeply to people's stories for 35 years, and I've come to believe two things about people. The first is having witnessed so many incredible stories of hope, adaptability, and human capacity, I truly believe that we are all capable of so much more than we really think we are. In times of challenge, humans have demonstrated that over and over again. Here on the Recalibrating podcast, you'll get to hear amazing stories of healthcare professionals and others pivoting, overcoming, and recalibrating their lives. The second thing that the research and my experiences as a psychologist have shown me is that humans need each other. We need people. When we have support around us, when we tell each other our stories, when we connect through the reality of living our lives, we do so much better than when we pull back and hide what's really going on for us. Together on this podcast, we're going to unearth and amplify what helps us as humans individually and collectively to recalibrate in ways that help us change, grow, adapt, even surprise ourselves when life throws us a curveball. This podcast offers you the chance to be inspired and encouraged to meet the unexpected in your life with grace, skills, and a belief in your own human capacity. Life is full of opportunities to recalibrate with agency, the right mindset, the right resources, and the right community. Today, it's my honour to be introducing you to Victoria Lister. Victoria is a researcher and a doctoral student under examination in the Griffith Business School in Brisbane, Australia. Her PhD investigated the powerful occupational forces that prevent junior hospital doctors from speaking up about their working conditions, a topic that she is now very passionate about, and I join her in that passion. And that has led her to the realisation that PhD candidates undergo a parallel process like junior doctors of simultaneously being tested for suitability and groomed for entry into an elite and highly competitive profession with special rules that are not necessarily made explicit. As a result, she has expanded her research interests to doctoral students and early career academic voice and silence, and their mental health and wellbeing. Victoria is also a qualified workplace coach, supporting new and early career professionals in academia, medicine, and nursing, and is currently researching and delivering a coaching for communication program for emergency medicine clinicians, which she'll also tell us about. Prior to academia, Victoria worked in hospitality, advertising, and in the not-for-profit sector. She has owned and operated at least a couple of small businesses, and she continues to consult to not-for-profit organisations on healthcare professionals' wellbeing and workplace safety. We have a lot to talk about. Welcome, Victoria.
Thank you, Sharee.
It's really super that we found some time together pretty quickly, so I'm very grateful to you for that. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
As we've started each of these podcast conversations, I wonder if you would tell us a little bit about your current working life. What does it look like in the ordinary, week or month of Victoria Lister at the moment?
A bit of a juggling act. More recently, it's been about completing the PhD. So there was probably a 3-month period from around Christmas time to mid-March where it was nothing but. So a lot of things got relatively sidelined, work things and life things. So there was a period of playing catch up after that. But I'm back into a rhythm now of doing other kinds of research work that I've been doing for a little while now, a couple of years. So one thing you do in academia is build a pipeline of projects because it takes a long time to do research and it takes a long time to publish your research findings. So you need a steady stream of projects that you have on the go that you work on over long periods of time. I mean, some of them turn around quite rapidly relative to others, but others don't. I have one which is a 2-year project and that'll be wrapping up at the end of June. Others are much shorter. But academics are very time poor people, especially the ones in tenured roles who are teaching. They have a lot of work in relation to teaching, and it's hard for them to find time for research. I'm in the position where I don't have a tenured role. I have a string of casual or sessional roles. So essentially, I'm a freelancer and I tend to focus on research rather than teaching, which research is my main interest. Yeah. So the week is very uh, mixed in terms of what can happen in a week. Sometimes it's hours and hours and hours of time in front of the computer, analyzing data, etc. I prefer the days where I'm doing things like this, where I have meetings with actual people and I'm not just communing with my computer. And I like having a multiplicity of projects to work on. I find that interesting and it keeps things fresh, which is why the PhD is quite a difficult task because it does go on for a long while and it's essentially a solo project.
I want to congratulate you again. I think it's a real exercise in persistence. And it seems to me, as an outsider, and I could be totally wrong, but it seems like it's a lovely outcome to find that you're actually passionate about what you're studying, that the inquiry that you found yourself engaged in was interesting to you. Please tell us a little bit about your PhD.
Yeah, look, I came to it very serendipitously. I was actually working as a research assistant post having completed a Master of Philosophy, which is a master's level thesis or research degree. Then COVID came along
Mm.
and that put the kibosh on that particular project. So I lost that job. And I thought, oh, I still want to hang out in the research space. I'm just getting to understand really what this is all about. So I kept an eye out for research oriented roles and I saw an ad on Seek, one of our common job seeking platforms here in Australia, that was for a PhD scholarship in employee voice in healthcare.
Mm.
And I thought, oh, I heard of employee voice. I don't know much about it, but it sounds interesting. Healthcare, I don't know anything about really. Anyway, I applied for it and I was successful. So I was, I guess, thrown into a world that was quite new to me, even though I'd investigated other research topics in the business and management discipline. None of them centered around the concept of voice, etc. And its twin, which is employee silence, which is the area I ultimately became very interested in and focused on, uh, primarily because silence is the far more predominant um, phenomenon in healthcare.
Mm.
People tend to be far more silent at work than they are vocal. And that was, to me, the thing that demanded attention. When I looked at healthcare professionals, frontline healthcare workers, and this is in the hospital context, I became interested in junior doctors specifically because, well, for a couple of reasons. One, they are key people in the delivery of medical services in hospitals. It's very hard to pin down exactly what percentage they form of a hospital workforce. Um, but I think at least over half of all doctors are junior doctors working in the hospital context, perhaps as high as 70%. So
Mm.
they are, in fact, the workhorses of the delivery of medical services in hospitals. But because they're newcomers, they're also subjected to a lot of different pressures that are particular to their junior status and their status as new professionals in the medical profession. And I found that very interesting. An additional factor was that as doctors, they nominally top the medical, well, the healthcare professional hierarchy in hospitals. So they're quite influential people, even though junior doctors are not necessarily influential until much later on in their training if they're going down that specialist path. But as newcomers, they're also vulnerable, therefore, to silencing. They're also much more aware of it, or can be. But I argue in the end result, they're actually not that aware of it. Some are, many aren't, because of the pressures of their role.
Mm-hmm. I think that the general research into voice says that people lose their voice at work very rapidly. They only need one or two experiences of being silenced to lose their voice. So I think we can dig into that quite a lot more. Before we go there, Victoria, will you tell us a little bit more of your backstory? Because you've really done a lot of different interesting things outside of health. And I wonder how that helps you in your question making of health, that you've got these other reference points. You just told me before we started that you left school, went to university, and then left university to become a chef. So maybe start there. It's very interesting in terms of recalibrating.
Yes, true. So I was one of those who left school not knowing what they wanted to do, didn't enjoy year 12, but managed to scrape into an arts degree at Sydney Uni. So I went off and attempted that. And I did that for 2 years, gradually losing interest, dropping subjects, and finally left. I couldn't stand it. It seemed to me to be a continuation of school. I felt like I was hanging out with the same people I'd been at school with. I did meet some new people, which is great. It didn't feel practical to me. So yeah, I left and went and did, well, something supremely practical. I took up an apprenticeship in commercial cookery, which is what qualifies you as a chef. And that that was a very interesting role, or series of roles, because I didn't work for the one employer. I worked in pretty good restaurants in Sydney. I'd come from a foodie background. I had foodie parents, so I knew a little bit about food and had an idea of the kinds of places I wanted to work in. Contrary to what we see on TV, I actually found it a fairly benign occupation in terms of things like bullying or harassment and so on. I know that's not everyone's experience, but there's a piece of about hospitality which is about bringing lots of different people into the fold. So particularly in Sydney, a lot of people who work in hospitality are, for example, gay or lesbian. So you've got quite a mixed crowd from the get-go. They come from different places. It has a sort of vibe that's a little less staid than other kinds of occupations, perhaps. And I actually really enjoyed most of my kitchen experiences. The harder things for me were more the physical aspects. And so they're very hot. There's a lot of heavy lifting. You get burnt a lot. You get lots of cuts. And you have to deal with the pressure of, in a busy environment, constant orders coming in. And that can be really tricky in some areas of the kitchen. During that time, I also established a small food business. So my then partner was also a chef. We were both apprentices. We were earning around, I remember I was on $120 a week.
Wow.
Yeah. So we thought, what can we do to earn extra money? Foolishly, we decided to start a small business, which doesn't always earn a lot of money. But it was a wonderful learning experience. And we were able to take that enterprise. We were manufacturing gourmet foods. We started with a small range of jams and a marmalade and expanded over time to pretty much anything you could put in a bottle. And it was at the time where sun-dried tomatoes were hitting the culinary scene. So we were working a lot with sun-dried tomatoes. We had a range of chocolate and caramel sauces. We had vinegars and oils, and we took that to quite a reasonable level. It became a largish cottage industry. We earned a living from it, but you know, we weren't in the big time, put it that way.
You didn't get to sell it to Heinz or something.
No, 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 we did not. People copied some of what we did, that's for sure, because we were front runners at that time. There were very few local gourmet products on the market. So we're talking mid 80s here. We were selling into places like David Jones, like Myers, upmarket delis, and then ultimately partnered with a food distributor who was able to take our products even further. So we were in a small factory by the time we both exited the business.
Did it meet your need? You know, you're at university thinking there must be something else. I could do something else, and I could certainly do something more practical. And so you had that adaptation or that change, that reorientation into the adult world, doing something else. Did it meet those needs?
Look, it did. It did. Cooking is a a very it's an interesting trade. Obviously, there's a lot of practical skills that you need to learn, but there's a science to cooking as well, um, very much so. And then there's the visual elements of putting together dishes, etc. So to me, that was very satisfying. The food manufacturing business ultimately less so because that is very process oriented and you end up doing the same things over and over. So that can get a little dull. Um, and that's pretty much where I landed at the end of it. It was like, yeah, I think I'm done here. It's been creative. The act of cooking is creative, developing products is creative, and I have that as a strong streak in me. But once you get to a certain stage, you're literally repeating processes over and over. Ultimately, I left there because I actually wasn't intellectually satisfied enough. So another serendipitous sort of event occurred where two people who knew me quite well independently suggested I consider becoming a copywriter. So writing copy for ads, basically. And they knew I was reasonably skilled at, writing and whatnot. And so I did. I trained in North Sydney with a wonderful woman who had been quite highly regarded in that profession or occupation. Um, and then I started out in radio, which was her first love as well. Radio is a wonderful medium to work in because you're running scripts in your head. Everything you read, you hear. I don't know if people are aware of that. When you're reading, you tend to hear it in your head. And when you listen to ads, it sparks like a little mini play in your head. You visualize what's going on. I mean, not only ads, but if you hear a radio play, that can be a very rich experience. So the best kind of audio ads are mini plays that leave a strong visual impression in your head. Are they the impressions you want to receive is another matter. But working in radio first up, and I did it for free, was amazing. I loved it. So I worked with a group of people who were ex Triple J and were setting up Radio FBI, which was ultimately successful, the successful bidder. We ended up on air for 3 months in a row. And I had so much fun. I had complete creative freedom. We didn't have advertisers, we had sponsors who were supporting the efforts of the nonprofit that was behind the station. And of course, great people to work with. Amazing. I had an amazing boss, and super fun colleagues, and I learnt a lot and I loved it.
So I'm
Yeah.
wondering already, listening to these experiences, of what's happening now in your understanding of the world about not-for-profit, about sponsorship, about teams, all of these. I think we forget sometimes when we get further along in our careers of these early origin stories that really have us orienting in the world in particular ways, or that open up new opportunities or new understandings for us. When you look back now, can you see things from that time that you still relate to in your work?
Yes, I mean, most particularly, I did end up after radio working in advertising agencies, two of them, which is a very tricky thing to do. It's very hard to get into. Every man and his dog wants to work in an ad agency. Um, and yet I didn't stay there. Part of me wishes I had, because the creative aspects of that kind of role are wonderful. It's a lot of fun. I mean, there's a lot of crazy stuff that can go on behind the scenes, but the actual job is really interesting. And I worked in an area of advertising which was what they call direct and integrated marketing. So it tended to be more long copy advertising, not short 30-second or 15-second ads on radio or TV, but longer, more persuasive forms of copy. Well, any creative brief is wonderful for getting your head around a business. So those kinds of experiences have been invaluable, and working with art directors and graphic designers has really honed the way I think and do things as well. So wonderful, wonderful experiences. But where I landed was I ended up in an agency through a merger that I hadn't had any prior interest in working in. And I didn't feel at home in that culture. And I reacted to that. I survived the merger, so I could have stayed and had a very fruitful career. And that's the part of me that wished I had. But I went into reaction around what it was I was being asked to do and who I was working for. There was a part of me that felt this isn't right. I don't feel at home promoting credit card spend at Christmas time when I know that people can't afford credit cards, let alone accumulate masses of debt. And coupled with the person I was now working for, I thought, I'm going to leave. And I found out not that long thereafter, perhaps, that the industry I then left for, which was the non-profit sector, was just as problematic as the for-profit sector. So that was a massive learning, and you could say recalibration for me. Though I've been through a few, every time you change industry, there's a lot to take on and learn about it, let alone the craft skills that you're learning. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Do you feel like all those different parts, the uni, when you're a chef, you were at TAFE, then the smaller advertising businesses, and then the bigger, the merged business and your side hustle, which you haven't mentioned that you have a current side hustle as well, which maybe we'll just put that into. Do you feel like all these different experiences built on each other, I guess? Do you feel like that you now have this sort of rich textural, lots of perspectives to how the world of work and how people in the world of work can be?
Absolutely. And I think that's the common thread. I mean, there's no rhyme or reason to the career choices I've made when you look at the things that I've been doing. But yes, there has been an ever-present fascination with the world of work. And when I went into the nonprofit sector, it was initially as an employee. I worked for a disability employment service. So organizations that support people with disabilities to find work. So it's very much about understanding what people are interested in, where they can be placed in this instance because of their limitations. So yes, and everything that I've learned along the way has involved business, has involved organizations, be it larger businesses, corporations, um, small enterprises, micro enterprises like my own. And yeah, now I'm in, for the moment at least, academia in business and organization and management in that discipline area. So there's no surprise. I grew up with parents who were entrepreneurial. My father was a serial entrepreneur and a successful one. That to me was normal, and it was interesting as well. My mum pitched in. She was a creative, and she pitched in to support them in their early years by drawing on her artistic skills. She trained as a sculptor. So there was an amazing sort of influence around me that I just took for granted and felt very at home in, and ended up expressing those aspects myself.
I think it might be interesting, your story, Victoria, on a number of levels. But one of the things I'm noticing just now is the contrast between certainly doctors in training and I think from some of the things you've said in academia as well, these train tracks, some of our doctors get on, particularly the ones that come straight from uni. Sometimes they do biomed or something else, but essentially they get on the training to be a doctor track. And then they go into hospital for a couple of years, then they get on the training program. You know, there's a long time of investing in this same process, the next step, the next step, the next step, the next step. And there's a real contrast in what you've done, where you've taken some twists and turns and there hasn't been a clear linear process. So I really like that for our audience, this contrast that sometimes I think when we're in one industry, we forget that the rest of the world doesn't necessarily operate this way. And so you're providing a really nice example of how, you know, people have very successful, interesting careers that have twists and turns in them. So thank you for sharing.
Absolutely.
And just to tick off that bit about what's the current side hustle, I can hear some of our listeners going, so what is it? What does she do? So do you want to just speak to that briefly?
Yes. About 10 years ago, I realized that I wanted a product that wasn't available on the market, or perhaps more accurately, had just come onto the market. And I'm talking about, if people remember the brand Spanx shapewear. And this was sort of a new thing. Probably it's been in America or elsewhere longer, but it was new to Australia. And at that time, I was starting to feel I need a garment that is like a bike short as a piece of underwear. So it gives it a good coverage on the thigh, but isn't made of lycra for obvious reasons that women will appreciate. I couldn't find anything, and the likes of Spanx were sort of synthetic compression bandage type material. And I remember trying to a pair on in the change room one day at a department store, and I couldn't get them past my knees. It was like, oh, this is not what I want to be
Not what
wearing.
I want, yeah.
And I knew that other women felt the same, and they were going to things like bike shorts to solve a problem, to solve a particular problem. So I'm talking about women with larger thighs who might experience chafing, or just want extra support on the thigh rather than wearing a brief underpant. So I didn't know anything about the world of fashion. I hated sewing, all of that, but I had an idea in my head of what was needed. I started working with a friend who was a seamstress, but she was perhaps more oriented towards fashion rather than the more utilitarian pattern making that it turned out I was actually after. And by this stage, I had returned to university, and I'd met a woman there who was designing plus size lingerie. And I spoke to her and said, how are you doing this? She said, I have a pattern maker. I'm like, oh, can I meet this person? And that's how that evolved. So it started with this pair of what I call longer pants, long-legged underpants made out of super soft material, stretchy, breathable, as few seams as possible. And it's expanded over the years to about 6 different items, activewear, and mostly.
Do you want to say it so that people can put it in the show notes as well?
Yeah, sure. Hummingbird pie.
Hummingbird pie. Awesome. Okay, let's move on now to your actual research. And thank you for giving us that backstory. I think it's just really rich in variety, and it's a beautiful example of psychological flexibility and how we can imagine ourselves, have lots of different identities and imagine ourselves in new places, in new roles, and doing new things. So thank you for taking the time to give us some of your backstory. It's so interesting. We could spend the whole time chatting about it, but I think our audience probably want to hear about your research, and I want to give
Oh.
a chance for that too. So you've been studying young doctors who work in our hospitals here in Australia, and in particularly, you've been really inquiring what is it that helps them to speak up, what is it that silences them, and what's their experience of that. So can you give our audience some summary or some indication of what you've learned about this idea of voice and silence for young doctors?
Yeah, look, I'll start by describing what voice and silence are in the work context.
Great.
So, yeah, because it is a specific thing, even though we can talk about these concepts generally. So, employee voice is employees' ability to speak up at work about issues that interest them as employees or concern them, or about issues, suggestions, ideas that might be of interest to their organizations. So you can have employee voice being an employee focused phenomenon or an employer focused phenomenon, or ideally both. That's called an integrated approach to voice. Silence is the obvious flip side of that. So it's specific. So silence about issues that concern you or the organization. So employee silence is the flip side of voice. So it too refers to work-related topics, things employees might want to speak up in regards to their own working conditions, for example, or in the healthcare context, patient safety, or it can be silence about things that interest the organisation, which again in the healthcare context would be more to do with patient safety because that's a concern for organisations. So it's considered difficult to understand because it's essentially the absence of something. How do you study that? But it is quite simple to study in that you just simply ask people about their experiences with not being able to speak up at work and what that is like and what motivates them to not speak up. Why do they decide to choose silence? Do they in fact choose silence, or is it chosen for them? So that's the question I became interested in, or one of them. The silences that I focused on related to working condition silences. The literature that is out there primarily focuses on patient safety silence in the healthcare context for obvious reasons. It's a fundamental to healthcare, patient safety, but it's also a massive problem. The lack of voice around patient safety is a really, really big problem, and it's been that way for a long time. It was identified as an issue around the turn of the millennium in terms of research and has fostered a lot of research since. But no one seems to be able to know how to solve it, what to do about it. There have been many, many interventions. And as far as I can see, none of it has worked. Very little of it has worked. So I became interested in why. Why was this the case? And I specifically honed in on silences around working conditions because working conditions concerns are even harder for healthcare professionals to voice because they're generally second in the equation. So patients first, of course, but hang on, where's the healthcare professional in that? So their own working conditions concerns get sidelined. Having said that, if healthcare professionals are unlikely to speak up for patient safety, they're going to be even less likely to speak up about their own working conditions. So I felt it was very important to bring a focus to this other area of working conditions, which has been largely overlooked.
Mm.
And junior doctors I became interested in for the reasons I stated before. I call them junior doctors because not all of them are young. One of my participants was in her mid-50s. She trained as a nurse, a very, very senior nurse, and had worked as a nurse for many years and then decided to become a doctor. So there she was, going through internship and residency in her mid-50s. And there were some older people as well, not quite in that age bracket, but on the more mature end as well in my sample set.
And so what did you find, Victoria? What were the junior doctors telling you about their experience?
Overall, their working conditions concerns, I hate to say this, but outweighed their patient safety silence concerns. And this to me is understandable. I mean, in their hearts, they are definitely wanting to speak up about patient safety issues. But the things that affect them day to day are their working conditions.
Mm.
And in the junior doctor space, those working conditions are often very overwhelming to the extent that they then affect patient safety. So I'm not telling anyone anything new here if you are a doctor and you're listening to this, but the literature hasn't understood this or focused on this, which seemed to me an extraordinary omission. And I wanted to know why. Again, why? Why this mysterious gap when it seems quite obvious? And someone like me who's not in healthcare can walk in, read the literature for 6 months and go, oh, hang on, this is missing, this is missing, this is missing, and this is missing. But there's an explanation for that too, which we'll probably get into.
Please tell us now. I'm dying to know.
So what I then did was focus on what was also missing from the literature. So it was well established that professional factors have a large part to play in patient safety silence, because that's where the literature was. The small amounts of literature that had focused on working conditions also identified professional factors. And what I mean by that is what I then started to call factors related to occupation. So if we peel that back a bit, a professional is a type of occupation. So if you look at the standards for considering occupations, managers is one, professionals is another, trades and technicians is another, and so on and so forth. So I started to think about what were the occupational factors that were interfering with people's ability to voice. And as I said, some of these have been identified, and it has been identified in the literature that healthcare professionals are hamstrung by certain aspects related to their occupation, such as the hierarchy that's present in their occupation. It could be the ideologies, the occupational ideologies associated with their occupation. And I started to see that this was particularly the case in the medical profession, which has a very strong culture around it, very powerful ideologies that permeate not only the medical profession, but society itself. We have a lot of societal mythology about doctors, beliefs about doctors and who they are and their status and their standing and so on and so forth. I essentially got to the point where I couldn't get the answers I wanted from either the management literature or the health literature, which is the two areas I'd been focusing on. So for answers, I had to turn to the sociology literature, or not had to, but that's where they were. there's a whole strand of sociology called sociology of professions. And the medical profession features quite prominently in studies because it exemplifies the kinds of things that are that impede and construct social groups and that particular social group. So there was explanation there for how occupational groups in the professions form themselves, why they behave as they do. Well, actually, not necessarily the why. That came from a separate strand of literature, but they certainly, there's been a number of scholars over the years who've looked at the professions and particularly the elite professions. So when we're talking elite professions, it's medicine, law, divinity in the first instance. That was in the Middle Ages when those three came to prominence. Over the years, that's expanded. Divinity has dropped off. So we now have architecture, accounting, law is obviously still a part of that, and other professions that have emerged more recently. But the elite professions in particular behave in certain ways that secure their status, that set the tone, if you like, for what that profession is, carve out spaces. They're social spaces, first and foremost. So they carve out spaces amidst the broader social environment and declare certain things about themselves and that they do certain things and that they have certain knowledge, which is then transferred typically through university education. They also behave in quite aggressive ways. So this sort of boundary setting or carving out of territory can lead to quite interesting stoushes between different professions, each claiming their space, sometimes trying to intrude into the other's space. So we see this a lot in the medical profession with the ongoing debates around cosmetic surgery versus plastic surgery. There's been
Well, I'm thinking just now of the policy shift with the government between what pharmacists can do that would
yes,
be traditionally what general practitioners would do. You know, I think that's a good example
yes,
of what you're talking about.
absolutely, and nurse practitioners.
Nurse
You know,
practitioners have a much bigger role in New Zealand than they do in Australia at the moment. Exactly. Same
interesting.
things, these boundary shifting or challenges. Or seen as a boundary challenge. They may or may not be meant to be.
Yes, yes. Well, I mean, the degree to which they're aware of what they are doing is debatable, but it is definitely protectionist in its sort of intent. We're protecting what we do, and
Mm.
we have good reasons for that. We have patient safety concerns, etc., etc. But when you view it from a helicopter view, it's quite an interesting uh, scene in that it's quite combative. And
Mm.
one of my arguments is that this sets the tone for how the profession is. There's these sort of chessboard moves being played out at the highest levels
Mm.
that then arguably trickle down or influence the ethos or the culture of that particular occupation. So I hate to say this, but the medical profession is often drawn upon in the literature as an example of a particularly aggressive profession.
Mm.
And you can see from how we think about doctors, how we think about medicine, that it does occupy quite a significant place in the hierarchy of professions or occupations more broadly, and how we think about doctors, as I mentioned, generally.
Certainly, we
Um,
we see that in parents of high school students, don't we? We see, so and
yes,
so wants to be a doctor or a lawyer. There's, sort of this ripple of regard that goes around the whole community about this bright student who's going to be an engineer or a lawyer or a doctor. I hear that. I don't know if you're hearing that in your work. I hear that with the people that we're coaching, that they're often concerned if they change course or if they do something different from the medical train track that I was referring to before, that they'll let down so many people, that the other people are invested in their admission, if you like to use the kind of phrases that you're thinking about, the admission into that profession.
Yes, that I found that too in my research, and I've heard it in some coaching conversations and general conversations as well. And certain cultures certainly place a lot of emphasis on, their children being doctors or lawyers or what have you, and that came through as a theme as well.
Victoria, can you come back around to
Mm,
I guess the themes or the conclusions that are coming from your work with junior doctors about voice and silence? Are there things that are there pointers? Are you finding things that we can work towards to help our junior doctors, given the deep hierarchy and the things you're describing about competitiveness and so on in the
mm,
medical world? What can we do? What are the things that can help our junior doctors have more voice?
yeah. The main thing I believe needs to happen is that senior doctors need to lead on these issues because they, at this point, particularly if you go into specialist training, are the doctors who control outcomes for careers, for the profession itself, the people in the upper echelons of hospitals, of medical colleges, etc., often of regulators, universities, the whole bit. There are pockets of what I call pockets of enlightened leadership that kind of came to light on a couple of occasions in my research and the other work I've done in the last 6 years on this topic. Um, but they're far and few between, and they're hard to sustain because they're not happening at the level of the organization mostly. They're happening at the level of a department or a unit or a hospital. But where they do occur, they're wonderful. And what I believe is happening um, in those more enlightened environments is that those senior doctors have recognized, at least to some extent, what I call the medical professional game that is being played. So, a feature of the game, and I drew on the work of a sociologist called Bourdieu for this notion. He devised the term the game, but it describes the rules that are in place or the game that is played in occupations or in any social space in which there's jockeying for power and position, which is pretty much all of them. And a feature of the game is that you don't realize you're playing it, or perhaps you willfully misrecognize, and that was his term, misrecognize that you are immersed in a game and that you are, in fact, playing it. And there are reasons why that occurs. But I suspect that those doctors who recognize what is going on recognize it as detrimental are those who can actually do something about it and create environments in which people feel psychologically safe to speak up, which is a term that gets bandied around a fair bit and is a little bit misused, but it refers to the psychological safety to speak up at work as opposed to other ways of thinking about that. And it's not to say that junior doctors or early career doctors is another term can't get involved in that kind of activity, but they're often not in a position where they can because of the control that's exercised over their working lives, over their careers, over their job choices, over their training placements, over their exams by the people who are in fact the same vehicles for silencing them. Because there's a lot of, as many would know, what I call workplace abuses that occur in the junior doctor space that in tandem with the implicit messages they're receiving from university onwards, if not high school, as you mentioned, onwards, about how to behave and be as a doctor, there are a lot of compelling reasons why they don't speak up because they can't, which effectively eliminates the notion of choice
Mm.
in silence. I don't know that
What's
they are choosing it.
What's the cost, Victoria? I think that, it's all, as you're alluding to, it's a lovely sentiment to think that everybody has autonomy and everybody has choice and people should speak up. And there's some very interesting research around whistleblowers and what happens to whistleblowers and so on. I think that's very real across industry, not just in medicine.
Yes,
That would have a person that's lower down in the hierarchy that is dependent on references from the people further up the hierarchy to progress their career and so on. There's a lot of good reasons to stay quiet. And I think certainly the people that I talk to, the doctors that I talk to, of the view that, it's a cost benefit analysis. It's less risky to be quiet. If I'm quiet, nobody can challenge me on it, or I won't end up being accountable, or I won't end up being in review or whatever. But if I do speak up, there are all these known potential risks, and very often people have witnessed a colleague go through those potential risks, and so they're very real. What's the cost?
absolutely.
What's the cost for doctors making that choice, which seems the right choice and probably is for some of them the right choice? But what's the cost of not speaking?
Yeah, look, your findings are the same as mine, that there is exactly that, a cost benefit analysis that is conducted by every junior doctor and senior doctors as to whether they're
Whether it's
going
worth
to
it.
speak up or not, whether it's worth taking the risk. So
Mm.
there's a lot of fear. So there's fear-based violence, which is fear of the relational risk, the reputational risk, the career risk, the risk to yourself if you speak up, because speaking up comes with its own set of challenges. You
Mm.
then get potentially, if you make a formal complaint, thrust into the world of having to deal with that. And who wants to deal with that on top of all the challenges of being a junior doctor? There's risk to others. There's a sense that collective forms of voice, so union activity, are not necessarily embraced either because there's a fear that this is going to impact the patients because it's often associated with striking, which isn't always the only option available. But I can't do that because I'm going to affect my patients. There's also a lot of futility, so hopelessness. Um, I've seen people speak up, nothing changes. Um, there's uncertainty. I don't know how to speak up. I don't know the mechanisms for speaking up. I'm not good at speaking up. There's unfortunately self-sacrifice was another
Mm.
theme. Silence is a strong belief in medicine that silence is evidence of commitment to calling. So if I can soldier on, prove I'm not a troublemaker, I can cop it on the chin. It's can unfortunately a badge of honor.
I think this is really interesting. You've used the word calling, and it's really evident in older literature about how people come to medicine that it's a calling. I'm not sure if our current generations use that word or if they feel it in the same way, that maybe they do feel it, but they call it something different. You were doing some of your work is qualitative research. Were people using that language? Were young doctors or early career doctors using that language?
Not that precise language, you're right. It is a little bit old school to think in that way. People are more interested in having a career
Mm.
rather than a calling, or see medicine as a career, which I feel is a more balanced
Mm.
mode.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but you can
Yeah,
hear, it's easy for me to imagine exactly what you said, that if I feel like it's a calling, um, uh, not to say that it requires martyrdom, but there's more kind of sense of I tolerate this or I put up with this because this is what I was put on the earth to do, sort of thing.
yes,
Whereas if I'm thinking about my job as my job in medicine, which is still has all the elements of wanting to make a difference, wanting to contribute, wanting to care for people, um, uh, wanting to make the world a better place, these things can all still live without that sense of the bigger forces kind of determined that I ought to be a doctor. It's a
Yes,
different frame, isn't it?
it is. It is. I agree. Uh, Nonetheless, there was this sense of self-sacrifice that still permeates the
Mm,
profession. That I, I put myself out on a limb. I put myself last or second. It's about the patient first.
mm.
And I hear this among nurses as well, because
Yes.
I've done a little bit of work with them.
Yeah, I completely concur. I meet that all of the time that, I have to show
Mm.
up for my colleagues. That's one of
Yes,
other one.
yes,
What about the patients? If I refuse to work 16 hours, who will see the patient? These kinds of things.
exactly. That's what I'm referring to. So it's probably calling is probably not the right term. I'm not sure I even use it in my thesis.
I'm not trying to call you out in that sense. I
Uh,
think I think there are lots of senior doctors have that experience.
yes,
Lots of them. Actually, it was Ben Bravery, who I know that you know, who's a
yes.
fellowed psychiatrist in Sydney. It was Ben at a conference saying on the stage in a panel that really brought my attention to this, saying that he was saying, I think that junior doctors see their work more as a job or a career. I'm not sure that they see it as a calling in the same way as it might have been described in the past. Uh,
Mm,
yeah,
yes. In fact, there's a good paper on this very issue, generational um, ways
difference.
of thinking about
I might
working conditions.
I might ask you to share that with me, and I'll put it in the show notes for our audience.
Yeah, I could probably share the link. I'm not sure if it's open access, but if it is, I will.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So let's keep moving just in the interest of your time, my time, and the listeners' time, because there's still a few
Yes.
things I want to cover off with you. Do you feel like your research has garnered interest from the wider medical audience? Do you feel like people are listening and curious and interested in finding out more about what they can do to create more pockets of enlightened leadership, as you call them?
Not as much as I'd like. You know, in the circles that in which I met you, there are very many interested parties, doctors and like us, non-doctors.
Mm.
There is a good reception there, of course. I, in fairness, I haven't yet published my PhD research. I've published a couple of things around it, or tangentially, but that is the next step to get it out into some journals that people are going to access. I'm always happy to come and speak to people and present on this work and so on, because I do feel it's so important to talk about, what's really going on here. But no, as yet, and I understand why, because my work is kind of critical of the medical profession and what it's allowed in the
Mm.
name of the profession.
Mm.
You have this incredible situation where voice is prescribed on the one hand, as in doctors are told to speak up for patient safety, but voice proscribed on the other. So speak up, don't speak up, because the clear message is you're not to speak up about your own working conditions.
Put your
You,
head down and get on with it.
yeah.
Mm.
And I don't know if many doctors know this, but I went and looked for the Hippocratic Oath.
Mm.
And there's now a modern Hippocratic Oath, which, well, probably everyone does know this, but I did not know this. But the modern version issued by the World Medical Association includes, alongside patient safety, practitioner safety. You're
Mm.
not to harm yourself, and that's a key tenet
Yeah, so
of
it actually
obligation.
requires obligation, exactly. Yeah. Mm.
Yes.
Mm.
And yet the profession behaves in a way that ensures this obligation can't be
Mm.
enacted.
I really I look forward to that time, perhaps post publishing, perhaps post podcast, this near time that we're coming into where more people are actively saying, how are we going to apply this? I think the change in occupational health laws around psychosocial risk and psychosocial safety are going to help us. And that's for another conversation. We don't have time to dig into that today. But I really want to congratulate you and thank you for the work, because I think it's generating conversation and to encourage you that we all feel sometimes that this is so slow moving. But when you've put it into the sociological context that you have today about professions more broadly and about how the culture of professions is deep and developed over centuries, really,
Mm.
and brought into the academic sphere of education as part of its prestige and rigor, that these things aren't going to change quickly, and they do require lots of these kinds of conversations where we're saying there is a reality here which is not the reality we want, where
Yes.
young doctors are squashed in their capacity to speak, and that has an impact on patient safety, which is what we all are actually here to try and provide.
Mm.
And that we as seniors or advisors or administrators or coaches or whatever our other roles are, can have a role to play in continuing to bring our attention to this issue and to can be a part of the striving to do it differently and more effectively for patient benefit and for worker benefit. So I
Mm.
really do want to encourage you to keep going. Anybody who's listening to this, if you didn't pick it up, Victoria just offered to come and speak to your group if you're if you're able to do that. So I guess it's a general kind of rallying call for us to all keep working on this issue of having voice at work, and for our medical people to have voice about whatever they see that might affect our capacity to have great, excellent patient care.
Mm.
How do you want to wrap up our conversation? Is there something we've missed or something you want to go back to and emphasize as a way of moving to our
Yeah. Well, one thing is, and I'm sure you have said this on many occasions yourself, um, is that often it's not safe to speak up. So I'm not blithely encouraging people to start voicing left, right, and centre, because there are can be serious repercussions for doing so. But awareness building is essential. I mean, let's talk about the fact that we can't speak up and that we are forced to endure often difficult working conditions because of that. The other thing I just wanted to loop back to was, you mentioned, we were talking earlier about adaptability in careers and so on. You know, it's been such a privilege for me to meet doctors. I love working with them, with you, um, because you are such wonderful, and I mean you, I know you're not a doctor, Sharee, but
the audience?
to
Yes.
the doctors listening, you are such amazingly capable, bright people that literally anything can be achieved. And yes, you can have that career adaptability.
Mm.
It's there already. You know, it's a wonderful blend of intellectual expertise and hands-on work. So coming back to that notion of merging those two things, you know, the practical with and the craft skills with something that's a bit more cerebral. I think medicine is a wonderful expression of both those things, and hence the capability that I see in the doctors that I meet. So literally, I think if there was a focus on awareness of the game that's being played, there can be some work done to dismantle it.
Mm. Yeah.
Mm.
So, as a way of finishing, what do you keep in mind when you know that you've got to recalibrate? What's the kind of mantra or the belief, the little trick that you rely on when there's the crossroads or a moment that you think, oh gosh, I need to make a decision here?
Usually, I try and get myself out of the way.
What does that mean?
As, I mean, I I examine my thoughts. Like, what am I thinking? Is it true or accurate? Or am I being fed something that perhaps comes from a societal belief or something someone else has said to me? What is actually true to do in this moment? And in all honesty, as my career trajectory will attest, I follow my nose. And I guess you could say I follow my body. So what feels like the true thing to do, that's where I land. I try not to think too much. This is a whole other podcast, but I am deeply skeptical of the industry I'm now in
Mm.
and see it as problematic as medicine.
Mm. I love that, Victoria. It sounds like what else might be true or what else could be true. And also that somatic thing that yes, you're right. We could have 10 more podcasts together, but that idea of noticing what's in your body as well as what's in your head, that's a lovely place for us to land. Thank you for
Mm.
everything you've shared today. It's been really interesting learning more about your life and the way that you understand medicine. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. It's been amazing.
I hope that you're enjoying hearing some of the researchers and the people around healthcare workers who are working very hard on behalf of healthcare workers. Victoria Lister is another one of those people, and I hope to introduce many more of them to you over the coming months on Recalibrating with Sharee Johnson. Victoria has such an interesting personal story, and we did take some time with that today. So if you skipped over that and you might like to go back. I think the contrast between what she demonstrates in the twists and turns and the very non-linear career that she's created, her capacity to change industries, to step outside and wonder what else she could be, who else she could be in the world of work is, pretty inspiring, really. And such a contrast, particularly to people in medicine, for doctors who are, you know, prescribed for such a long time about what the next step is in their career. And of course, the second half of this conversation really was about hierarchy and what stimulates or helps people have voice and speak up in their workplaces and what doesn't. And Victoria's particular interest is in junior doctors. I found her knowledge and her demonstration of what makes a profession, the sociological view of what makes a profession and what's the tone of a profession and how does that create environments that are conducive or not. The implied message not to speak out that's very strong for junior doctors. So I think that's huge food for thought there about the origins of a profession and what the deep cultural norms are because of that and how that maintains the status quo for people. And so if you are a senior doctor, if you have a leadership role and you're listening to this conversation, I really want to encourage you to challenge these cultural norms, the tone of the profession. You have so much more power and capacity to really challenge that than any junior doctor has. The junior doctor really is managing, as she said, their reputation, their relational, their idea about putting patients first, which means that they must come second. And they really need sponsorship and champions in their environment to help them speak up about their experience. We know from the training surveys every year that we still have very significant issues around discrimination and bullying. And so I hope that you will look at Victoria's research. She will be soon to be published, I'm sure, even though she reminded us how long those processes take. And to remember that there's huge complexity for all of our doctors and all of people who work in healthcare. I think that nurses will have this experience, and certainly allied health people do too, this tension between speak up and not speak up. Victoria began by telling us that people don't speak up often about patient safety issues. So why would they speak up about workplace safety issues? I think this is very, very concerning, and we ought all be bringing our attention to the idea that people aren't speaking up about patient safety, and that if that is indicative of how hard it is to speak up, then we really need to all contribute to shifting this norm. So some challenging ideas today. They might have been a bit provocative for you. I hope that you'll approach them with a learning, curious mind rather than a knowing it all or a defensive, protective kind of mind, and that we can all advance this conversation. Until next time, may you be well. The content in this podcast is not intended to constitute or be a substitute for professional medical or psychological advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your doctor or other qualified healthcare professional. This podcast represents the views of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect those of any entity we work with or for.